I'm Rosemary Agnew. I keep saying I'm the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman, but in this context, I suppose I have to say I'm also the Independent National Whistleblowing Officer, because they are technically two separate terms. For the purpose of today, if you can, while we're doing the presentation element of the session, keep your microphones and videos turned off. You will note that we are going to be recording this session. The idea behind that being that we can publish it, share it for anybody who couldn't make it today. There will be an opportunity at the end to ask questions, but I strongly encourage you to turn the chat on, and as we go through, pick up, type in any questions you have. And if we don't manage to pick them all up at the questions at the end, we'll certainly send out an update. Now, before I move on, I'd just like the team to introduce themselves. So if we can do the pass the bat, I'm going to pass it to you, Fran. And if you could pass it around so that we can put names to and faces to some of the people that you might have been talking to or emailing over the past few months. Over to you, Fran.
Hello, yeah, I'm Fran Richards. I'm the team manager, and you'll be hearing from me as we progress through this presentation. I'll be presenting some of the information, and I'll be also passing over to Amy for some of it to run through a scenario with you. So I'll pass on just now to Amy.
Thanks, Fran. My name's Amy Hillman. I'm one of the complaints reviewers within the INWO team, and as Fran said, I will be taking you through some of the scenarios as part of this webinar. I'm not sure if is anyone else in the team in the meeting?
I think Edward is.
Edward?
I'll pass to Edward then.
And Stephanie's here as well.
Hello, everyone. I'm also one of the complaints reviewers at INWO. I won't be part of the meeting today, but a similar role to Amy. I'll pass to my colleague Stephanie.
Hi everyone, I am Stephanie. I am the, I do have my little thing on there. Yes, I am the team officer to the team, so you will have had several emails from me over the course of the past couple of weeks, and I hope that you enjoy today's session.
Thanks very much. For those of you who already knew us, welcome. It's nice to see you again. If you hadn't already met us, even in this context, you're very, very welcome today. Do we move on to the next one? Thanks. You'll be glad to know I've almost finished my bit of this. You don't need to listen to me coughing and spluttering through this. As has already been hinted, the way that we have structured the session is we're going to just do some initial outlining of the standards and the initial actions to take when receiving a concern. What we're then going to do is make it a bit more interactive and, as Amy said, work through some scenarios to try and give some practical examples of how this will work in practice. And I'm going to stop now because I'm almost run out of voice. And I think I'm handing over to Amy or Fran now.
Yep, I'm taking over at this point. Thank you very much, Rosemary. Sorry. So I wanted to take the opportunity to start by having a quick look at what the standards say about when you receive a concern. We're going to go briefly through the steps that need to be taken when someone brings a concern to your organisation, whether it's to you or to the confidential contact or another manager. And then we'll go on to look at these steps in more detail as we progress through the presentation. So part 2 of the National Whistleblowing Standards provides an overview of the procedure and when to use it. And this includes definitions and support for the support and protections that are provided through the standards and confidentiality. It reviews the interaction between HR and whistleblowing. And of most importance to us now, it looks at initial actions that you need to be taking when someone first comes in with a concern. So this reviews who the concern should be raised with, whether it's a line manager or another senior manager, a confidential contact, or through a raising concerns email address. It also highlights the importance of speaking to the person to discuss their concerns, and we'll come on to that in a little minutes on the next slide. At the end of this conversation, the person will need more time potentially need time to consider what they want to do next. And it is for them to decide if they want to access the standards and the whistleblowing process. If they say they do, then you can move to part 3 of the standards, which details the 2-stage process. Depending on how the person raised their concern and what it relates to will influence exactly what happens next. The standards are clear that the organisation needs to consider whether an issue is whistleblowing, and if they agree that it is, there needs to be another detailed conversation, a stage 1 discussion as it's termed, and we'll look into that as we move through the process. Once it's clear that the person wants to use the whistleblowing process, it's really important that the issue is logged. Even if the organisation ultimately decides it doesn't meet the definition of whistleblowing, the case is closed, it still needs to be logged. The standards specify what needs to be logged, and organisations should all have a logging system in place now. Many of I know Scottish boards use Datex, but there are similar alternatives out there. If you think someone may raise a concern with you and you're not familiar with how to go about logging a concern, it's probably best to speak to the whistleblowing coordinator in your organisation to find out how you can log concerns that, if anyone should raise them with you. One of the other early considerations is, can the issue be responded to or even resolved as a stage 1 concern? This might be the case for kind of straightforward issues where someone's raised, they've raised it through the whistleblowing process, but because they're not sure how else to raise it, or because it involves the senior manager, or where they feel vulnerable for some other reason, that they're having difficulties for some other reason and feel that it would put them at risk if they were to raise it in an informal way. If, however, the concern is clearly complicated and it takes longer than a week to investigate and respond to, and you can tell that from the outset, then it needs to move directly to stage 2. The standards again set out what you need to do here, but it's really important to make sure there's an opportunity to have a detailed case discussion with the person that's raising their concern that captures as much information as possible, though it may still be necessary to go back to the whistleblower to check out some details. It's good to start off the process with as much information as you can gather. Once an investigator has been identified, it's important to let the whistleblower know who they will be and whether it will be necessary for their details to be shared with the investigator. Remember, it's not always going to be necessary to share the individual's details with the investigator. So, for instance, if they're just a witness to an event but have very little knowledge of the context or circumstances and have already shared everything they know, it's possible that it's not actually necessary for the investigator to know who they are and won't necessarily help things if their information is shared more widely. That's a very quick run through of the kind of key elements of raising a concern and getting them to the stage where you're starting to think about the detail of the concern and investigate or respond to it. So we're going to look at some of these stages in more detail, particularly the discussions that you need to have with the whistleblower to tease out not only what's required in the standards, but also to explore some of the good practice tips and hints that we've got. So moving on to the next slide, that's looking at the initial actions. So going back to, this is when a concern is first raised with a manager or a confidential contact. That first responder may be a range of people. It could be a senior manager, it could be a whistleblowing coordinator, or someone in a team responding to a generic speak up or responding to concerns inbox, an email box that I know a lot of boards now have. And who receives the concern will influence to some extent the subsequent sequence of events, because it depends on their capacity to take action or to identify whether stage 1 action can be taken, resolution can be taken. But whoever they are, the key to the success of the interaction is about listening. It's really important to speak to the person, to discuss their concerns and really listen to what they're saying. It's helpful to thank the person and make them feel that they've done the right thing, because it's quite a nerve-wracking process to raise concerns, and quite often people feel that they aren't sure whether they're doing the right thing. Make sure they know that it's okay to raise the concerns that they have, and that getting a good outcome is important for everyone, for them, for the organisation, and for the other people they're working with. And it's important to listen to what has happened so far. It may already have been raised in some way, but it may not have been. And this is really a helpful opportunity to understand what's going on. It's useful at this stage to consider whether the concern seems to meet the definition and fall within the scope of whistleblowing. But it's not the first responder's role here to make a definitive decision. It's more to share information and potentially manage expectations, to think through with the person raising the concern. And that might include thinking about, is there a risk of harm or wrongdoing? If you think it's clear, that's fine. And if you think it's not clear, you can always seek advice on that from your whistleblowing coordinator. It's best to assume at the outset that it is whistleblowing if you're unsure, and to seek advice as you progress with the process. But you don't want to be suggesting to someone that their issue isn't of significance too quickly or too early. If the person's eligible to access the process, and normally if you're talking to an employee, then they would be, obviously. If they're a student, trainee, they would be, and potentially if they're a volunteer, they would be too. So it's likely that they will be, but it's best to just check that you're clear on that, or what their role is. And the other thing to think through, one of the things to think through, is the timescales. So the procedure sets a limit of 6 months from when the person first noticed the issue, but there is flexibility there, particularly if it's an ongoing issue. So again, at this stage, it's best to consider that it is within timescales, unless it's a clearly historic issue and you think there's no way that it's going to be within timescales, or you want to manage their expectations slightly around that. One of the next things to really think through is whether they want to use a business as usual process or the whistleblowing process. Sometimes it's easy for a concern to be resolved through an existing business as usual process, such as discussing the issue at a team meeting or finding an appropriate solution, reporting it on DATEC, so senior management or clinical safety colleagues are aware of the issue and can take action. But if business as usual isn't appropriate because the person feels vulnerable, or they've tried business as usual before and it hasn't been successful, then it's important to explain why the process, business as usual process, might be appropriate, and why the whistleblowing process might be appropriate and what it would mean for them. If they're unsure what route to take, it's important to explore their options so they can have a chance to talk about what their concerns are with either route. Discussing what approach the person wants to take is likely to involve explaining what the procedure is and what stages there are to it, what to expect from it, and also what options there are for business as usual processes. Is there a specific way for that issue to be raised through a business as usual route which would make sense, like a significant event or a review or anything like that? When you're sharing information about the whistleblowing procedure, it's helpful to focus on the confidentiality and support it provides. That can be really important for people to really get a full understanding of. And particularly of significance are all elements whistleblowing. So do they need to use other HR processes or other significant options for them? It's important that you think through if there are elements of what they've raised that you don't think are appropriate for whistleblowing. Can you signpost them, or can you help them to access the appropriate procedure? And that will depend a bit on what your role is. Obviously, if you're their line manager, then accessing some of the HR processes will be important for your role as well. But if you're a confidential contact, you might want to be able to just signpost them to HR or to their line manager for those elements. If you think a concern is more appropriately addressed through an HR process, it's important to consider if that process will address all of their concerns. There might be patient safety issues which need to be considered separately alongside the HR process. And we're very familiar with the entanglements, as it were, between whistleblowing and HR processes. And we've kind of already had some experiences. We're rapidly building up more experience of how to manage these things. And we'd obviously be happy to give advice on at that early stage. So if you can always phone us to think through that situation, if that would be helpful. It may be that the person raises an issue that they think needs immediate action. And you need to talk to them about this, what you would like to do with the information that they've shared with you, and whether they need support or protection in the short term, as well as during any subsequent investigation. They may be taken aback by the idea of immediate action. They may relish the opportunity for it to be resolved quickly, but it's important to share with them who you're going to share the information with and why. At the end of this conversation, the person may well need time to consider what they want to do next. And it's for them to decide if they want to access the whistleblowing standards, the whistleblowing process. It's important for that the person knows how to get back in touch with you or with confidential contact, how they progress with their concern. They can follow up on the conversation in whatever way they need to once they've made their decision. So that at the end of the initial actions, you really kind of unless there's some immediate action that needs taken, you generally pass the ball back to the individual for them to think through what their decision is for taking the next step. I'm just going to pass over to Amy now, who can progress with the next stage in our talk, which is looking at a scenario.
Thanks, Fran. So yes, I'm just going to introduce a scenario that we can work with. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what the concern itself is about, but it's just something to use for us to walk our way through the process of receiving concerns at different stages. So I'll read it out to you, and then if we can ask you to put any thoughts and answers to the questions in the chat, and then I'll come back at the end and just go through the answers that we thought of in advance. So the scenario is that a nurse has noticed irregularities with record keeping on patients' notes and believes that it could lead to errors in the care and treatment provided to patients. The nurse has raised concerns at a team meeting, but colleagues and the team manager weren't really receptive and nothing seems to have changed. So the nurse decides to approach a more senior manager to raise the concerns and talk about it. So imagining you're the manager that the nurse has approached, what would you do? So if you can put any thoughts based on what Fran's just gone through into the chat, I'll leave it for a couple of minutes and then I'll come back and run through some of the answers that we thought about. Okay, thanks everyone. We've got quite a lot of answers here now. So Fran, if you can move on to the next slide for me. So lots of people are talking about listening to the whistleblower, and that's one of our big ones. The first one we come up with was thanking them for the concern, and I think that's really linked. So make sure that the person understands that they've done the right thing, listen to what they have to say. Establishing the facts is another one that's come up a few times. We've got, does it fit the definition? And I think that's linked into that as well. Is there a risk of harm or wrongdoing? Is the person eligible to raise the concern? Is it within time? Advice and signposting. Again, we're suggesting that you think about whether or not there's any aspect suitable for another process. So if you're listening to what they're telling you, some of it may be whistleblowing, some of it may be more suitable for a grievance process. So at this point, is it worth signposting to any other process? Information about the process. It may be that the person hasn't heard of the standards or isn't sure whether or not they want to access it. It's important that you can provide them with a bit more information or signpost them to maybe someone like a confidential contact if you're not confident yourself on exactly what's involved. Discuss support options that might be available within the organisation particularly if the person's feeling nervous. And then the last one that we had here was confidentiality and information sharing. So discuss confidentiality under the standards. Any concerns that the whistleblower has at this stage around their identity becoming known? Start thinking about who might need to know what if you're going to be looking at it. I'm just having a quick look through, see if there's anything else from the answers. Yeah, asking what they'd like to be done about it. And just finding out more about what the concern involves. I think they're all really good answers. I'll pass back to you, Fran, to move on to the next step.
Thanks, Amy. I just wanted to pick up on one thing. I know that one or two people have been asking questions in the chat, so we'll pick those up at the end. I know Rosemary's commented that she's going to be taking a note of them. So if you do have any questions as we're going through, please put them in the chat and we'll pick them up all up at the end if that's all right. So looking at receiving the concerns at stage 1, we're going to move on to what happens when the whistleblower decides they do want to access the standards as the safest route for them to raise concerns and ensure appropriate actions taken. So details of how to manage this are in part 3 of the standards, which is the 2-stage procedure. When they come back, when the person comes back to their manager or the confidential contact and just confirms that decision, the person then really needs to log the concern at that point. Organisations will vary on how this is achieved, and I know that some organisations have had concerns about it. I'm not sure whether every board is enabling all managers to record concerns, but it's certainly important to understand what mechanisms there are in your organisation for you to be able to log concerns. And assuming the issue is straightforward and easy to resolve, the manager maybe think they can resolve the issue at stage 1. They still need to make sure they fully understand the concern and the outcomes the person is looking for. So we'd really recommend that there's some more thought given at this stage to the issue in particular and to having a conversation with the whistleblower. They need to make a more definitive decision as to whether the concern fits with the definition of whistleblowing and is eligible for the standards. If it's complicated, again, they might need to seek clarification on this or refer the decision to the whistleblowing coordinator if there's a very balanced judgment there. And if the decision is ultimately that it's not whistleblowing, then the organisation needs to share that decision with the whistleblower in writing and also to signpost to us, the INWO, because that is a decision that we can then consider ourselves and investigate if we think it's appropriate or look into whether that decision has been reasonable. Assuming it is clearly a whistleblowing issue, it's important to fully understand the concern that's being raised so all elements of it can be addressed. And the key issues to explore might include ensuring that they've had a chance to share all the information they want about the issue, what's happened so far and what their concerns are, what outcomes they're wanting. And I know this was mentioned in the chat earlier, and whether they're achievable. It may be necessary to manage their expectations in some way. If you think that what they want isn't going to be possible, not to put them off raising the concern, but just to say that the way you address it might be slightly different from what they're expecting. And what action they think the organisation needs to take to put things right. They may not really know how to put things right, but they may have really clear ideas, and it's really important to hear those ideas if they do have them. Can all the issues being raised be resolved through this process, or would some again be needed to be signposted via HR? And I think one of the things about coming back to this discussion that we've certainly found is that some of these things are things we've talked about in the previous slide, but as you talk further and further about issues, you'll get to understand that quite often you hear more information from a second or a third conversation. And each conversation may bring up something that you hadn't really thought of before, whether it's an issue that's not going to be resolved through this process or an action that they think they want taken that you hadn't picked up on before, or a side concern that's actually quite important to the main concern. So it's really important to kind of reflect back on some of these points that we've already touched on before. And again, it's important to reflect on any issues that might need immediate action if something else has come up, and also what support the person needs. With that in mind, there needs to be a decision to be made about whether it's suitable for stage 1 early resolution or stage 2, because even if at the beginning of that process you think it's, you can definitely resolve it as an early resolution issue, it may be that having thought about it and heard about it a bit more and having reflected on it some more with the individual, that I think it's actually better for a full investigation at stage 2. So that decision needs to come kind of when you've got the full suite of information in front of you. So I'm going to pass back to Amy now to look at go back to our scenario.
Thanks, Fran. So the nurse has gone away and thought about it and decided that they would like to access the standards. So they return to the manager and say that they'd like to raise a whistleblowing concern. The manager thinks to begin with that they would like to try and resolve the concern at stage 1. They think they're in a position to be able to do that. And so they asked to meet with the whistleblower again to gather more details in order for them to progress. So we're going to follow exactly the same process. If you can imagine again that you're the manager who's now received this concern, what should you cover during this first discussion, or I suppose it's the second discussion with the whistleblower? Okay, thanks. We've got a few answers coming through here. Fran, if you could move on to our next slide, please. So there's a focus in a few of these comments about support, and again, that's one that we've got there. Reassurance to the whistleblower about, that around confidentiality is another really good point that's come up, and what the process involves too. I think also a lot of the responses that came through on the first stage of the scenario are relevant to this conversation. So you really want to establish what's happened so far. Make sure you understand the concerns that the person's raising and the risks that are involved with those. Is there any background information that would be useful at this stage? Does the person raising the concern want to put forward or supply you with any evidence or that they think would be important for you to consider? Are there any witnesses or anyone else involved or aware of the concern at this stage? What might you need to do practically in order to investigate, and how might that impact on confidentiality? What kind of conversations can you have with the whistleblower at this stage to reassure them that their confidentiality will be protected? Can you discuss and understand any concerns that they have around that? What outcomes is the whistleblower looking for? Are they achievable? So all of these kinds of things are what we would expect to be covered in that first conversation. And then finally, I've got log the concern, which isn't part of that discussion, but it's what definitely needs to happen at the end of that. Back to you, Fran.
Thanks very much, Amy. We can move on now to looking at receiving the concern at stage 2. So assuming the concern is more appropriate for a stage 2 investigation rather than early resolution, the case has come from the person who first received it, from the line manager or confidential contact. It's been logged as a whistleblowing concern, and it's moved to the person or the team who coordinate the whistleblowing process for progressing with a stage 2 investigation. Before any investigation can start, it's important for that coordinator, who's maybe new to the case at this point, to have a clear understanding of the concern. And obviously they'll need to consider any information that's been gathered and passed on to them from the manager or confidential contact to make an initial assessment of the case. But they'll also need to speak to the whistleblower again to get some more detailed information from them. And I know this may sound like we're going back to the whistleblower to tell us their story all over again for a third time. And I think sometimes, that can be a bit of an issue. So that's why it's really important to keep notes of your conversations so that, you can pass on a full set of notes when you're passing them on to an investigator or to the coordinator to make sure that they've got as much information ahead of time. But there will still be issues that it's helpful for that coordinator to make sure they've got a clear understanding of, so that any response that comes from that team can really answer all the questions that the person has, can respond to all the issues of concern rather than just the ones that have been passed on to them. And our experience is that whistleblowers actually are quite happy to share their stories several times. It means that someone's listening, and that's really what they're concerned about. It's important that that conversation is quite high quality conversation, that there's time to go into it in some detail, so that there's no rush on to get as much information out as quickly as possible. So so that you can identify exactly what the concerns are and what the risks there might be for patients or staff at this point, and how to best mitigate them. So there's a range of information that's specified in the standards in part 3, and also in an appendix to part 3, where we set out a bit of detail about what the issues you might be wanting to look into or how to ask those questions. It's really important that the whistleblower continues to feel that their concern is important and that they're being taken seriously and listened to. So that's partly why we've set those questions out in quite a lot of detail. There are a range of decisions that will come from this discussion, so it's important to have enough information for them. For instance, obviously, have they raised it before, and what's happened so far? Has there been any action taken yet, or any investigation before now? Who else might be involved, as Amy mentioned, in the investigation? Is there any evidence or witnesses? That the individual might themselves be aware of what evidence there might be available or might be important, and it would be useful to hear their thoughts on that. And what outcomes are they seeking? Again, what do they think should be done to put things right? We've mentioned this before, but this may provide clear ideas of where what options there might be. It might also be a good opportunity to manage concerns again. And this information will feed into decisions on the scope of the investigation, so that you can provide clarity to the investigator on what elements of the case they should or shouldn't be investigating. Who should investigate? Generally speaking, and this is something that's mentioned in the standards, this should be a senior member of staff from another department or service wherever possible. But obviously, if it's a small organisation, that's not always possible. So it's good to have a conversation about who will investigate. These points are all covered in the standards, as I mentioned. There's also the additional questions that would be important to consider, as noted again, the ones that we mentioned at stage 1. So if there are any risks that need to be addressed straight away, that these can be actioned on, and that the person understands that action is going to be taken. Will the whistleblowing investigation cover all the issues that have been raised, or should some of them be considered through an alternative process like HR, like we mentioned before, and what support they have through the process to access this, and how will they access the support? Do they know how to access it, and what assistance the organisation might be able to provide? Again, those are questions that have been mentioned before, but someone that felt like it was fine when it was their manager dealing with it, and they're now aware that senior management are involved, they may suddenly realise that it's a bigger deal than they first realised, or is going to take more investigation, and they may start to feel like they're putting their neck out a bit further than they expected, and getting a bit nervous about it all. So it may be that they kind of start to feel the need for support at this stage. So I'm just going to go back to Amy now to progress with our scenario.
Thanks, Fran. So last part of the scenario, we've got the manager has looked a little further into the concern and realised that actually the issues that have raised are a bit more complex than they'd anticipated, and they think an investigation is going to be required. So the manager informs the whistleblower, the nurse, that the concern is going to be investigated now at stage 2, and passes the concern and the information they've gathered so far onto the organisation's whistleblowing coordinator. So same again, we'd like you to imagine that you're the whistleblowing coordinator receiving the concern at stage 2. And if you could just pop in the chat your thoughts on what your initial considerations should be, and then we'll come back in the same way and I'll go through what we thought. Okay, I'll come back in. Again, some really good responses coming through in the chat, and quite detailed responses as well. Thanks, Fran. So lots of people saying that there's already been quite a lot of information gathered, and so we'd need to review all of that and then make some decisions on how to proceed, which is exactly right. Does it fit the criteria for whistleblowing? Can we offer any more support at this stage? So that's really good. Things that we'd thought about: acknowledgement at stage 2. An acknowledgement needs to go out quite promptly, within 3 working days. So an acknowledgement to go out to the whistleblower. Initial views on the scope of the investigation. What's it going to cover? Looking at the information you've got so far on what the concerns actually are. Identifying the investigator. Who's the most appropriate person to look at this? Will they be sufficiently senior to be able to make recommendations? Are they sufficiently kind of far away from the complaint itself or the concerns themselves to be able to look at it impartially? What risks are there involved, and is there any action that can be taken immediately to reduce those? Contact the whistleblower again. Do you need any more information after you've reviewed what's been collected so far? Can you clarify with the whistleblower how involved they'd like to be in the complaint, and whether or not they have any specific concerns at this point around confidentiality? Do they need any more support that you can offer or signpost? Again, check in on the concerns and the information, and should there be any signposting to other procedures at this stage? Is there anything that's arising that would be more suitable for HR, for instance? Can we give any more information to the whistleblower about the process that they don't know already, what to expect in terms of timescales and updates? So yeah, there's some similar themes, I think, coming through each of these discussions, but mainly you want to be supporting and reassuring the whistleblower, and then at this point really starting to progress with getting the investigation underway. Thanks, Fran.
Thanks, Amy. That's great. So that's really the end of our presentation. We hope that that's kind of run you through the process of receiving concerns. Obviously, it kind of suggests what happens next. And I guess there's a range of different options in terms of what happens at stage 1 or stage 2. So we're obviously absolutely keen to be able to provide advice to you if you're in the situation where you're receiving a concern. Our advice line is available to managers or confidential contacts that are receiving a concern and want some advice on the process, and how to support that individual with that situation, with the concern that they've come to. Once a case has been considered, is being considered under the standards, once it's definitely a whistleblowing, the organisation has agreed that it's whistleblowing, it's with any request for advice that you have from us at that stage, which we'd be happy to respond to, will actually come from our improvement standards and engagements team. They can give general advice about the application of the standards in a specific context. So in relation to a specific case or a set of scenarios that are put to us. We do things in this way because we want to avoid any conflicts in relation to decision making on a complaint that may come to the INWO. So where an organisation knows that they are accessing the standards, then there's a potential for that concern to come on to us. And we don't want to have any restriction on our later consideration of that case. We're also really happy to provide whatever support for implementation boards would find useful, whether that's sharing your ideas with us and asking for assistance, or asking for us to come to any meetings you're having. Plenty of others have done that, and I think it's generally been useful and pretty easy to achieve. There's also the TURAS training modules, and we'd really recommend that anyone that's receiving or potentially receiving concerns looks at the modules for those receiving concerns. We've had really good feedback on them. They might take a little longer than you like, 2 to 3 hours, but I think it's worth it to get a really good feel for what's expected of your role as a manager or even a confidential contact. Our bulletins come out once a month, and they provide a taste of the work that we've been up to, and also top tips on implementing the standards. When we start reporting on cases, that's where that we're investigating, that's where we'll share the information that comes out of those. So it's where we also share any updates on our website or resources. So it's a useful place to and way to hear of any updates from us and keep on abreast of what's the latest is with us. So that's all from the presentation side of things. We've got plenty of time for some questions, and we'd be very much welcome those. I know some have been coming through the chat already. And these are our contact details if you know them. Amy, if you could stop the recording now, we'll move on to answering some questions.